Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, talking about predicting the climate in 100 years. 14 years ago, the southeastern United States was experiencing a drought, and it was reported by the always reliable independent newspaper, America is facing its worst summer drought since the Dust Bowl years of the Great Depression, or perhaps worse still. But the long-term implications are escaping nobody. Climatologists see a growing volatility in the southeast weather. Today's drought coming close on the heels of devastating hurricanes 2 or 3 years ago. In the west, meanwhile, a growing body of scientific evidence suggests a movement toward a state of perpetual drought by the middle of the century. The 1930s drought lasted less than a decade. This is something that could remain for 100 years, said Richard Seeger, a climatologist at Columbia University and lead researcher of a report published recently by the government's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Wow, that is a scary sounding 100-year forecast. Now let's look and see how this leading climate expert did with his 100-year forecast. Since then, the United States has had its wettest years on record, and the United States has been getting steadily wetter since the 19th century. The most severe droughts in the United States occurred during the 1950s and the 1930s, but recent decades have been quite wet. Dr. James Hansen of NASA started the global warming scare before Congress in 1988 during the last really bad drought which the United States experienced. Hansen predicted that the 1990s were going to be very bad drought years, but they ended up being extremely wet. The long-term forecasts by climatologists haven't been working out very well. Now let's look at some shorter-term forecasts. On January 21st of this year, the Climate Prediction Center at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration issued these forecasts. They predicted that most of the United States was going to be very warm and that Texas was going to be hot. It's not unusual for Texas to reach 90 or even 100 degrees during February. But they got their forecast exactly backwards. There was record cold across much of the country and many people froze to death in Texas. NOAA later reported that it was the coldest February in the United States in more than 30 years, with record-breaking deep freeze engulfing much of Texas. So the February forecast didn't work out too well. Now let's look at the March forecast. Once again, they predicted very warm and dry in the Rocky Mountains. Instead, we had historic and crippling snow, as USA Today described. Parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Nebraska were blasted with up to 4 feet of snow, while Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Missouri braced for heavy rains and flooding. In fact, it was reported 3 days ago that Denver is having their wettest year on record. Here in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where I live, February and March have been the coldest since 1965. We are buried in snow and it's not melting. I took this photograph yesterday west of Cheyenne. This object over here on the right is a cattle fence post. The snow there was about 7 feet deep. This storm was comparable to the historic January 1949 storm of legend. I took this picture last weekend in front of our house. Toto and Kyrie are not convinced that we're having a permanent drought. It was about 4 days before we were even able to get out of the house. Kyrie and I went out hunting spring wildflowers yesterday, but we weren't very successful. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center showed that they can't make accurate forecasts 2 weeks in the future, but we're supposed to believe that they can make good forecasts for 100 years. In 1986, NASA's James Hansen predicted a huge amount of warming by the year 2020 in the United States, 4 to 6 degrees. And in 1988, he predicted that there was going to be a huge increase in drought. But by 1999, he lamented that his forecasts were failing rather badly. He wrote in 1999, "Empirical evidence does not lend much support to the notion that the climate is headed precipitously towards more extreme heat and drought." He said, "In the United States there's been little temperature change in the past 50 years, the time of rapidly increasing greenhouse gases. In fact, there was a slight cooling trend throughout much of the country." This was the NASA U.S. temperature graph which Dr. Hansen published in 1999. It showed that 1934 was the hottest year in the United States, that 1998 was much cooler, and there was a significant cooling trend since the 1930s in the United States. This upset Dr. Hansen because according to his models, the United States was supposed to be getting much hotter, but it was actually getting cooler. So he did what government climate scientists almost always do. He altered the data. The current NASA temperature data set has erased the heat of the 1930s. 1934 is now cooler than 1998, and there is a significant warming trend since the 1930s instead of the cooling trend which Hansen showed 20 years earlier. I'm going to flip back and forth between these two graphs a few times. The current NASA graph shows a warming trend, but in 1999 it was cooling. Current warming, 20 years ago they showed a cooling trend. I'm very familiar with the underlying data, having studied it for more than a decade. The 1999 version of the NASA temperature graph was fairly accurate, but the current graph doesn't even remotely resemble the underlying data. This graph is a fraud. People see these sort of graphs from government agencies and assume that the graph represents the thermometer data, but they don't. NASA has erased the heat of the 1930s, but that's not going to bring the thousands of people who died in the heat during the 1930s back to life. Now let's look at what the fundamental problem we're dealing with government climate science. This paragraph is from the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies website, which was run by Dr. Hansen for many years. It read, "The basic GIST temperature analysis scheme was defined in the late 1970s by Dr. Hansen when a method of estimating global temperature change was needed for comparison with one-dimensional global climate models." This is a huge red flag. We have the same people doing the climate modeling and measuring the temperatures for a comparison. So when the climate models failed, what they did was alter the data rather than fix the models. They came up with all sorts of excuses for altering the data, which I've examined in great detail. Unfortunately, the explanations they've come up with can only account for a small amount of the changes they've made. The vast majority just appears to be blatant data tampering. A good analogy for what's going on in government climate science would be a sporting event where the same players play for both teams. And both teams had the same head coach who was also the referee, the scorekeeper, and the cheerleader. You could be pretty certain about the outcome of a sporting event like that, and nobody would put up with that in sports. So why do we put up with it in climate science? The outcomes in climate science are predetermined, and they have nothing to do with actual science. These people are pushing a political agenda. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this fraud for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.